Mary Anning's Curiosity, Chapter 2, Lessons at Low Tide. Joe stood outside the chapel on Coombs Street, trying to spot Mary in the crowd of girls and boys that streamed out of the white building with the arched windows. Joe was 3 years older than Mary and finished with school. He hunted for fossils with Pa or helped him in his workshop, making furniture or cleaning the curiosities they found. Joe didn't want to be a carpenter like his father. Far worse was the thought of scrounging for fossils all his life. Joe wanted to learn a trade, but apprenticeships cost money, more than the Annings had. Joe spotted Mary and shouted, "Don't hang about! Tide's out!" Low tide came twice in 24 hours and gave beach hunters a few hours to explore before it swept back in, perilous and persistent. If you were caught in its sly advance, you could be cut off from the footpath in dry land. Joe was getting impatient. The beach in a gusting wind wasn't his favorite place to be, but he had an eye for finding fossils, same as Mary, and the family needed as many curiosities as they could find to sell on market days. Mary rushed over to her brother. "I love my ammo, Joe," she said. "I'm making it my good luck charm." "Had a good first day, then?" replied Joe. Mary nodded and smiled. "It's nothing but an old rock, Mary," said Anne, "but it was thoughtful of Joe to give it to you." Anne liked Joe and was always a bit shy around him. "What's in the sack, Joe?" she asked, sweet as syrup. Sometimes Mary thought Anne was the silliest girl she knew. "Hunting gear, of course," Mary replied before Joe could, "including the rock hammer Pa made me for my birthday." Joe turned and left, heading in the direction of the stone steps that led down to the beach. Mary yelled, "Goodbye, Anne," and ran to catch up. The hard storm had brought mud, rocks, and trees crashing down from the cliffs. Boulders and stones covered the sand and made walking tricky. But Mary was nimble and had been clambering on this beach for years. She knew how best to keep from slipping. "Here's your hammer and pick," said Joe. "Be careful." Mary didn't need a warning. The cliffs were always unstable, but after a raging storm, rock slides could happen in the blink of an eye. It would be impossible to get out of the way of a slide if you were rowing too close to the cliffs when it happened. Further down the beach, Mary's father was hard at work. She decided to see if he had found anything. She kept her eyes on the ground as she headed in his direction. Soon she was lost in a trance, not hearing the waves behind or the gulls above, only seeing the stones at her feet. Mary peered into rock pools full of water left behind by the tide. In one she spotted an unusual pattern and knelt to take a closer look, her skirt trailing in the water. Under the stinking clumps of seaweed that covered the rock, Mary saw a fine line. She removed the weed, and there it was, 5 arms, delicate as a spider's web. "I found cement, Joe!" Joe wasn't too far off and came over quickly. "What is it?" he asked, kneeling beside his sister. "It's a starfish, I think." "Yes, it is, and a fine one, too," replied Joe. "It's hard to find one with all 5 arms and not a single one broken off. Good job, Mary." Pa had heard Mary and come over too. "Joe's right, it's a perfect starfish. Some call them brittle stars because the arms break so easily." The fossil was embedded in a boulder that was too heavy to carry home. "How will we bring it home, Pa?" "We'll carve an edge around the star and bring it home in a chunk," said Pa, "but we best make haste. Tide's creeping in." Mary saw it was true. The sea was slowly slipping back. When the tide went out, it roared like a lion. When it returned, it tiptoed in like a cat on silent paws. Pa and Joe worked together, chipping as quickly and carefully as they could. Soon they had a chunk that they could carry, with the brittle star safely tucked inside. "Don't forget yourself on beach, Mary," said Pa, wrapping the rock in a rag. "A good fossil hunter is a patient one, but when the tide turns, you've got to be ahead of its rush or it will swallow you up or cut off your escape. It's a strong wash, so always keep one eye out. Even if you could swim, you're too small to keep from being dragged out to sea." Pa put the brittle star in his collecting sack. "I'll carry this one," he said. "You two bring the others. Joe, take the heavier sack. I've got some fine ammonites I found off the cliff." "Will the star fetch a good price, Pa?" asked Mary, slipping the sack with fossil tools in it onto her narrow shoulders. "No time for talk," yelled back Pa. "We've got to make tracks." "Come on, Mary," Joe shouted, encouraging her to step lively. They'd left it late. They were going to get their feet wet for sure. Mary scurried to keep up with Pa and Joe, who were racing for the sloping footpath beside the cliff. It led up and away from the sea and onto dry land. The surf was surging in now. Soon it would cover the beach. The thought of being dragged far out to sea made Mary move faster. "Don't stop. Don't look back," she said to herself, over and over as her shoes squelched in the wet sand. The footpath was up ahead, but Mary could hear the breakers rolling forcefully behind her and drawing closer. Wet sand was hard to run in, and Mary's feet were chilled, but she didn't slow up. Pa and Joe were already on the footpath. They both reached out so they could grab Mary as soon as she was close enough. Joe shouted, "Run, Mary, run!" It was exhilarating, trying to outrace the sea. Mary fixed her eyes on the footpath and pumped her legs as hard as she could. Pa was wading in now, as far as he dared, since he could not swim either, to meet her. Breakers rolled in swiftly. Suddenly a huge wave pushed Mary under. Sea water filled her nose and ears as she desperately struggled to come up for air and to hold onto her sack. The tide was pulling her out to sea. Instantly, Pa's strong arms scooped Mary up and carried her to the footpath. He didn't let her down until they were both safely on the cliff top. High tide surged in and smashed at the cliffs. Mary felt the sea spray on her face. "Thought you weren't going to make it," said Joe, near tears. "Let's get home quickly now," said Pa. Before following, Mary dropped her sack and shouted, "I made it!" And she had. In the nick of time, she'd been saved again.